Hello folks, this is Mark Foster and welcome to another episode of the Dr. Mark Foster Show. Today I will be addressing the subject of what it means to me to be a libertarian communist and why libertarian communism is, I think, an extraordinarily attractive position and how it differs from other, or at least some other, approaches to communism that are around today. First, being a libertarian communist to me means that one always takes the side of the oppressed. Always, with no exceptions, one takes the side of the oppressed. Whether that is women, whether that is black and brown people, whether that is the third world, whether that is the fourth world, whether that is poor people in one's own country, or just in general socially disenfranchised and othered people around the world. And that's, in general, how I would define being a libertarian communist. In other words, favoring or supporting the liberty of the oppressed, as opposed to the liberty of the capitalists. The capitalists, in my view, should have no liberty whatsoever. The only thing that capitalists should be expected to do is to abandon capitalism, to stop being capitalists. If the workers at some point become powerful enough to challenge the authority of the bourgeoisie or the capitalists, hopefully they will seize the power from the capitalists, collectivize the corporations, the factories, and other businesses, bring them under direct worker control, gradually seize control of the government itself as well, or perhaps suddenly seize it, and in effect completely transform the face of the world. Note that I said the world, not a particular country. As a libertarian communist, I am opposed to any kind of national liberation, or ethnic liberation, or racial liberation. That kind of liberation is more commonly favored by fascists. People who support, for example, the superiority of a particular race or a particular nation and want to see that nation liberated and be given a certain amount of power. An example, in the United States, the Make America Great Again movement, the MAGA movement. That movement is, in effect, an attempt to support the rights of white people. It is a pretty undisguised secret that when people talk about making America great again, the implication is make America white again. Take America back to a time, supposedly, when the United States was controlled entirely by white people. That's not to say that it isn't today largely controlled by white people, but there is a kind of fiction which exists among some fascists, that there was a kind of mythical, almost Garden of Eden, when white people dominated the world, dominated the country, and that is the world that we need to return to. That position is also supported by people who are commonly called third positionists. Third positionists fancy themselves as people who have combined elements of the far left with the far right. That is not true. Third positionists are fascists. but they are fascists who have adopted some progressive type causes, but only progressive to a certain degree. Still, what they do is they favor the liberation of a particular race or culture, but they also say, well, other races and cultures should be liberated too, but they should stay away from me. So people who support third positionism will commonly talk about things like national homelands, like a homeland for white people, a homeland for black people, a homeland for Asian people, and so on. In effect, that is what existed in apartheid South Africa, when the South African government created these homelands. Homelands that were designed specifically for black South Africans. And if you lived in one of those homelands, you were required to stay there. You could not freely travel from that homeland into the rest of South Africa. A similar kind of phenomenon exists today in the Middle East with Israel and Palestine. Although Israel has a kind of hegemony or dominance over Palestine, still, Israel claims that the Palestinians have their sovereignty, which of course is a fiction. They have the same level of sovereignty that people would in a prison camp. Palestine basically is a collection of walled cities. You are trapped if you are in Palestine. You cannot leave it, for the most part. Generally speaking, Palestinians are confined to Palestine. There is no way out. So although there is a claim that Palestine is for Palestinians, a kind of nationalism for Palestinians, and Israel increasingly is being seen by many Israelis as a land for Jews, there's no real comparison between the two. The standard of living in Israel and the standard of living in Palestine, there is no comparison between them. So in my view, Israel itself can be seen as a kind of fascist or neo-fascist type society, third positionist type society, if you will. It has certain progressive type principles like healthcare, free healthcare, various other kinds of things, ideals that are commonly associated with Western democracies, and yet it persists in oppressing the rights of Palestinians while claiming that they have some degree of national sovereignty. That is not liberty. The term libertarianism originated in left libertarianism. It originated back in the 19th century as a reference to libertarian communism, libertarian Marxism, libertarian socialism. Left libertarians defined liberty as communism or socialism, and capitalism as chains. In the 20th century, in the United States, thinkers such as Murray Rothbard took the term libertarianism and twisted it and gave it this new definition, basically referring to a kind of capitalism. And today, people like Ron Paul and perhaps to a lesser extent his son Rand Paul, both of whom are also physicians, have proclaimed themselves to be libertarians. Paul Ryan, the former Speaker of the House, also called himself a libertarian, and there are many people in the United States who call themselves libertarians. Generally, when they say that, they are saying that they are right-wing libertarians. I call myself a libertarian, but what I am is a libertarian communist. That means that I believe that freedom is impossible without the elimination of the capitalist world system. The term capitalist world system was coined by the American sociologist Emanuel Wallerstein. What he did is he developed a very sophisticated view of capitalism, which saw capitalism as not simply an economic system, but a system which included many additional institutions as well: political, artistic, militaristic, and so on. Meaning capitalism is a complex. It is not simply an economy. Similarly, Kimberly Crenshaw, when she developed her theory of intersectionality, which was later adopted into sociology by Patricia Hill Collins, when she developed her theory of intersectionality, she in effect defined capitalism as a kind of map. If you look at a map, that map has various intersections. One intersection might be race, one might be gender, one might be ethnicity, one might be disability, one might be nationality, one might be sexual identity or sexual orientation, and so forth. At each of those intersections, a different dynamic might exist. For example, someone who may occupy a position of supremacy in one intersection might occupy a position of being dominated in another. A woman who might be oppressed on the job, sexually harassed by her male boss, might come home. Perhaps her husband makes more money than she does. They find out that a low-income housing complex or tenement is about to be constructed in their neighborhood, and they join a group to try to fight the county or city zoning commission to prevent that lower income housing development or tenement from being constructed in their neighborhood. So in that case, both of them are acting as oppressors. So people can alternate from being oppressors in one intersection to being oppressed in another. If you take those two notions, Emanuel Wallerstein's capitalist world system and Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality, I think that presents a very good picture of 21st century capitalism. Ultimately, there needs to be a complete and total elimination of the class system. There needs to be an elimination of the wealthy and of the poor. There can be no people who are wealthy. There can be no people who are poor. Everyone should have an equal access to resources that exist in society. Does that mean that everybody needs to make precisely the same amount of money? Not necessarily. But the differences should be relatively slight or insignificant. In other words, everyone should be equal. There should be general economic justice under libertarian communism. Now, what distinguishes libertarian communism from what most people came to think of as communism, particularly in the last century, in the 20th century, with the rise of Stalinism in the former Soviet Union, with the rise of Maoism and the Cultural Revolution in mainland China, the rise of Castroism in Cuba, and so on. Communism in the 20th century was what can be called communism from above, or socialism from above. In other words, it was communism under a dictatorship. Communism was being enforced by a dictator upon the masses. The average person in the street had virtually no power at all, including free speech. Rosa Luxemburg, one of my heroes, supported complete and absolute free speech in communism. She was one of the first true libertarian communists. So the kind of libertarian communism that Rosa Luxemburg supported was communism or socialism from below. That means communism which is promoted by the masses, where the masses together will organize, will stage a revolution to overthrow the existing capitalist system and to set up a classless communist system in its place. That is the distinction between what most people think of as communism, which was kind of drilled into people's heads, the heads of people including me, who lived through much of the Cold War of the 20th century, where communism was seen as the brutal enemy. And there still are some forms of communism from above today, but not very many. Communism from above has mostly been a failed project. Even places like Cuba, which are sometimes seen as among the last refuges of communism from above, Cuba is gradually abandoning communism from above and is gradually coming into the capitalist world system. So when you try to impose a system on people, when people do not themselves desire that system and bring it about through their own struggles, that kind of system is ultimately going to be a failure. So what socialism or communism from below does is it attempts to eliminate that kind of problem and instead to argue for the complete reversal of communism, where communism is turned upside down on its head, as I would argue Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels originally intended it, where communism is something that is brought about by the masses and not by some strongman living at the top. That concludes this broadcast of the Dr. Mark Foster Show. Have a good one.